Hi, everyone. I'm so thrilled to be here. Thank you so much for spending this time with me on Friday. And yes, I'm going to be reading from my debut, The Waves Take You Home. Um, okay. Can you all hear me okay? Awesome. Okay, so this excerpt that I'm going to read is when my protagonist, Violeta Sanoguera, arrives to the restaurant, the family restaurant in Colombia, after living in the US for a long time. And she goes back, and the restaurant that used to belong to her grandmother is now, it's not looking the same. Okay, so I'm going to start. Chapter 5, Caminito. Caminito was for a long time one of the most elegant restaurants in the neighborhood of Barrio Prado in Barranquilla. It was the place where my mother got married twice and I had my first kiss. It was also the place that had been the center of our lives for all of us. Caminito was more of a home than the house was. It was the place where abuela, mama, and I had eaten most of our meals and had had family fights and quarrels. It was the only place I wanted to take refuge in after a long day. It always smelled the same, like azafran and tomatoes sizzling in olive oil. There were now dust and spider webs in the corners of the restaurant. The wooden furniture was beaten by comején. Termites, that bug that eats everything, the paper, the pictures, the furniture, the bug that eats memories, our memories. My family's memories were destroyed by that white miniature bug. And yet, before her death, I dream about abuela almost every night, about her smell of bitter lemons, sugar, and salt, the smell of her kitchen, the sweet scent of the things she used to cook. I dreamt about the places she used to take me for pastelitos de guayaba, the places that were now closed, of the hot smell of the sizzling oil that fried the hojaldre that she covered with a thin layer of granulated sugar while it was still warm. I dreamt about her lazy eye, which she got fixed later in life. I dreamt about her rudeness, her awareness of how much, how often, and how far people will go in order to hurt you. Caminito had an Argentine name, even though it was Spanish food. The restaurant was named after an Argentine tango, but was dedicated to my Spanish bisabuela and the memory of her Spanish Colombian immigrant recipes. That afternoon after the funeral, I walked around the restaurant. It was daunting to see the passage of time in a place that abuela had fought so hard to maintain. I passed my hands over the old dusty tablecloths. Abuela, who was once on top of every imperfection in the restaurant, hadn't noticed the browning edges of the fabric. There were signs of humidity damage on the walls. If Abuela had been healthy, she would have painted the walls herself. For her, everything had always had to be spotless. I stood by the kitchen door where she used to stand to observe the happy customers, the tables, and the infinite noise of a busy restaurant. Soon, my old memories of the restaurants would be replaced with the restaurant in its current form, a shadow of a place that had cost Abuela a life of sacrifice. Seeing the place like this felt like a second death of Abuela, one that would extend until the restaurant finally collapsed and became a ruin. Caminito, our inheritance. I pass a hand over the tablecloth fabric, reminiscing about more opulent times. Friday nights in Caminito were an event in Barrio Prado. If I closed my eyes, I could see Abuela standing in the dining room, talking to customers and making sure that everyone enjoyed their food. She loved seeing empty plates, people asking for for more food, and complimenting her sazon. At home, Abuela was strict, but in the restaurant, she would laugh expansively with a hand on her belly, showing her uneven teeth. Doña Emilia Sanoguera dressed up for her clients. She loved to wear black and pearls. She levitated around her restaurant, proud in her steps. Her way of bringing joy to the customers was through croquetas, good olive oil, fresh bread, and plenty of red wine. I could almost see her standing by the counter, tapping her red heels and telling me to go back home. There was no place in the restaurant for me. I needed to study. I needed to be better than the women in my family had ever been, because in her words, She was just a cook, but I could be anything that I wanted. Thank you. Thank you all. Awesome. So that was just a little taste of the Waves Take You Home. And now I'm going to talk a little bit about my experience and my journey to writing this book, which is my first book. And that feels very exciting. So yeah, I know a lot of us in the room are writing our first novels, writing our first short story collections, our first poetry collections. So I just want to say it's so hard and so exciting at the same time. So I want to talk a little bit about that. Okay. When I introduce myself, I always say the same thing. My name is Maria, and I'm a writer from Barranquilla, Colombia. That detail to me feels endemic to myself, like my name. I am from Colombia, from the Caribbean, close to the sea, where the sun burns every day of the year and the heat is so suffocating sometimes you can barely breathe. I came to the country 6 years ago with a dream, but without a plan. I was a teacher working for a university, teaching a lot of classes, over 100 students, and barely any time for myself, let alone writing. The plan was to go to a residency in Vermont, then go to New York City for a month to take a couple of writing classes, and then go back home. I never went home after that. I stayed, and that began the cycle of applying to work visas, attempting my hand at working in the US as an educator and writing teacher, reinventing myself and my work prospects, and writing my first novel, what will become The Waves Take You Home. The Waves Take You Home, previously called A Cilantro Wedding Bouquet, came to me in January 2020 in a coffee shop in Kingston, where I was still unaware of everything that was to come. I sat down and wrote about a woman who had arrived to Colombia after the death of her abuela and had arrived at the family restaurant to see all the decay, a product of a passage of time and the abandonment of the beloved property. That year, I had enrolled in a year-long course for writing a novel and would spend the next 12 months on Zoom with strangers, tending to the deadlines we had imposed on each other. Around September, my abuela's health in real life was declining. She was a victim of a cancer that was spreading through her insides, and I was unable to leave the country due to the pandemic and my latest work visa that hadn't been stamped yet. The urgent fear that I wouldn't get to say goodbye to her made its way into my writing. My debut, The Waves Take You Home, is about Violeta Sanoguera, a woman who, after living in New York City and building a life in the States, chasing dreams and aspirations of being an illustrator, goes back to Colombia after the death of her grandmother to realize she has inherited the family restaurant and that her grandma's ghost has stayed behind, anxious to deliver a message. I put many of the interests and elements I wanted to see in the story. My love for food and narrative center around restaurants, family drama, love triangles, and the Caribbean. But the thing I wanted to explore the more ardently was our connection with those ancestors, with the people who dreamt hard for us, that influenced us and deposited their fears into us. I thought long and hard about that. Where did the fears of our ancestors begin, and where did mine? I battled with a lot of imposter syndrome while writing my first novel. English is my second language, and writing a first project feels like there's a lot of you don't know. And at times it feels like you'll never learn it. Like somehow everyone else who has written a novel until now has it down to a science and you're on your own. I wish I had a formula or something that I could replicate for the next novel. But when it came down to it, it was a lot of sitting and staring at a blank page, battling the same fears my character was facing. The fear of the unknown, the fear of not being enough, the fear of not honoring my ancestors, my name, the place where I'm from. I sought solace in groups of writers of color, workshops, classes. I kept writing and publishing short stories, looking for that connection with readers and writers. I began realizing that my fear was not mine alone. I leaned into something someone told me. Fear sometimes just means you care. I made it my mantra. I feared because I wanted to tell the story right. I fear I feared because this story in many ways mirrored mine. I feared because I ached for my ancestors. I feared because I knew that this story would be out in the world someday, and there's no fear without excitement. When I look back at my journey, I realized there were some key components: interest, intuition, main question, heart of the story. Allowed me to break them down for you. The first thing that fueled my journey into writing my first novel was my interest. I knew I loved food, ghosts, and family drama. That was the first semblance of elements I wanted to fuel the story. That also fueled the fire of the first image of the story, that scene of the woman entering the restaurant that belonged to her ancestors. That's when intuition came knocking on the door, that first solid idea, the first sketch of a character that with feelings, fears, and goals. There was something that this character urgently wanted, and there was a backstory. With a want and a past, there's already a story. Then this led me to fabricate a story question, or what screenwriters called a dramatic question. The question that could summarize the main ordeal my character was going through. So just to break down this plane, for example, a story question could be, will Alex Skywalker, I don't know, go against Darth Vader and win? Or will Katniss Everdeen win the Hunger Games? So basically, those are story questions. Mine was a little bit more complicated because I'm long-winded. How will Violeta decide between two different cultures, two different lives, and which life will feel more authentic to her desires and wants when both sides are pulling her in different directions? And then this led to creating the world of the story, the side characters, the romance, the two cities, and the world that my characters inhabited. This also led to encountering the heart of the story. Whenever I was stuck, I would go back to that question. Does this scene advance this question in any way? Is it related? Does it belong? Combining all these elements and persevering was what led me to the story. Stories can be linear, but journeys don't have to be. When I look back at what led me to write this novel, I realized that what fueled my words wasn't all pretty or nice to talk about. Grief over losing my abuela, grief and guilt over not being able to say goodbye, conjuring ghosts on a story from the desire of wanting to talk to her once more, grief over immigration hurdles and not knowing an end in sight, and the desire that characterizes the beginning of carving a dream. The dream of building a life for myself in a new country on my own terms. Yes, it's a lot, all at once. And that's what I wanted to leave you with today. It's okay to for fear and inspiration to live in the same room. In fact, I think it's a perfect combination. It's great if your first novel contains so many themes that sometimes it feels like it's bursting out of the seams. It's great if your first book or your first story or poem feels deeply personal. It's okay to feel like sometimes you care too much. It's okay to write in your second language or in your first. No, you don't have to explain yourself to anyone. It's okay if your first book that makes it out in the world is your third or your 10th. At the end of the day, making it to the page, even when our hands are shaking and our hearts are breaking, can be a beautiful start. A start to a journey doesn't need to be perfect or beautiful in order for it to be meaningful. In fact, I would argue that it's better if it's not. All that matters is that you make that journey yours. Thank you. Thank you. Awesome. So now we are going to write. And this first prompt, I want to say, be honest, because I'm not gonna be asking you to share this portion. So we are going to be interviewing our ancestors. Think about a family member who is no longer with us. Imagine you're interviewing them and asking them questions you would want to know about them or about your relationship with them, or even the life they led before they met you. If you can, imagine the answers that they would have given you. I'm not gonna ask you to share, so please be honest. So for example, I have some examples here of questions. Who was your first love? Were you happy? What was a dream that you didn't get to fulfill? Why? And we have 5 minutes for this portion. Any questions or anything we need? Awesome, let's do it. Cool. Okay, so we're gonna continue this prompt with the next one. And this part we are going to share, but obviously no pressure. Using your answers from our first writing activity, free write a piece about your loved one's life or a situation that they were in using their voice. Totally okay to fictionalize or to use like a mixture of fact and fiction. Don't worry too much about themes, just follow the voice and see where it takes you. Trust it and lean in into the things they used to say, expressions they use, or even their humor. If the interview format was working for you, feel free to lean into that. Just follow whatever works. Any questions? Cool. So we have 5 minutes for this too. Awesome. Awesome. Okay, so I think we can go to the next prompt, which we're very excited about. I hope you like ghost stories. Yes. And it's not even October. What a treat. Imagine that your character is a ghost and they only have a couple of days to be in the world of the living before they have to let go. What is the first thing they do? Who is the first person they contact? Totally okay to pull some fingers here in this prompt. And what happens next? Okay, so let's get started. 5 minutes for this one. Cool. So let's do a Q&A if anyone has any questions, complaints.
Okay, great. I just want to know, like, how long did it take you to write your book? Because I know, like, there's a physical part of actually writing it, but also there's a mental part of like thinking about and like fleshing out your story. So, like, how long did that take combined?
Yeah, that's a great question. Before I was writing my book, I was writing a lot of short stories. I think I'm primarily a short story writer, and I was just writing a lot. And then the pandemic hit, and before I knew that the pandemic was coming, I had enrolled myself in like a year-long class to write a novel. And the reason why I did it, it was because I was scared. I was like, I don't know if I can write a novel by myself and like just hold myself accountable. And all of this to say is that that was like a year-long process. And I wrote it, the first draft, in around 6 months, 7 months. I don't know if it was any other month, if it or any other year, if it wasn't a pandemic, if I would have written it that fast. But I think there was like an urgency there with like my abuela passing or about to pass away during that time, and it just kind of felt like I needed to get the story out. Um, that was the first draft though, and after that there were probably 10, 12 revisions after that, if not more. I stopped counting because I was like, it's too much. But yeah, that first process was like around 6 months and then 2 years, give or take, for revisions. Yes.
Is there a part of the book that you're like extremely attached, like a certain part that you're like really attached to, or like a part that like when you read it back, you're like, yeah, I did that?
That's a great question. So this part that I read, I mean, I love it. And one of the reasons why I love it is because it was the first scene of the book that came to me, I was just like in a coffee shop in Kingston, which I had never been to before. And I sat down and opened my computer, and it was the weirdest thing. I just started writing this scene. And it made it through so many revisions of this book. This book changed so much, and this scene stayed. And there was like a point where my editor, who I really like, was like, "Do we need that scene?" I was like, "Yes, we need it, and no one can touch it." So yeah, that scene I'm very attached to. I think a lot of the scenes with the ghost, because I think that was like a conversation that I was having with myself a lot writing this book, was how did I wanted the ghost to materialize? Like I wanted the ghost to be a character that was just as important as any other living character. Like I wanted the ghost to have like thoughts and feelings and opinions, and my character is like a grandmother, so she was very opinionated ghost. So I was just, very proud of those conversations that my character has with the ghost as well.
I'm curious if there are any resources that you can recommend, like authors that you looked up to, books or podcasts or videos or whatever that like helped you through your process.
Oh my God, absolutely. So that helped me through my process. I always mention Kweli, an organization that is New York based for writers of color. They have fellowships. I don't know if they're open right now, but they open a few times a year. They have fellowships. They have two conferences. They have one for writing for children, and then they have one writing for adults. And they are so generous with all the fellowships. Like there's always fellowships for the conference, and there's like amazing writers that attend, like Victor Laval and Cali Fajardo-Steen. Like always, like the lineup is incredible. What else? In terms of podcasts, there is one that I find very useful. It does have a swear word in the title. Okay, that's fine. Okay. It's called The Shit No One Tells You About Writing. That one is very useful because it talks more about we can talk about more about the industry side of things. So like agents and getting a book deal, all of those things. So that one is very useful. I also really like to listen to craft talks. So for example, whenever I read a book that I really like, as soon as I finish it, or even if I don't like it that much, as soon as I finish it, I go to Spotify or whatever, Apple Podcasts, and I just type the name of the writer and then listen to their process and how that was. But yeah, I think, what else? I'm just trying. I'll keep thinking if I come up with more. But also, I think my email is on the. So if anyone has any questions or wants to come back to this question, like Maria, you said that you have more resources. Please email me and I'll like give you a more detailed response. The first name, Kweli. So Kweli, Kweli. It's amazing. Oh, and they also publish short stories and poetry, and they pay, which is nice.
Hi, I'm curious about your process for choosing a title because I know that's very important to your story. And I know that you mentioned that the title changed originally.
Yes.
So I was just curious about that process and what made you choose that decision.
Okay, so that's actually a great question. My title changed like 5 times. So first, it was called Cilantro Wedding Bouquet, which is a mouthful. I'm happy that it changed, but it had like a special meaning in the story. And then when we went on sub is when your agent takes the book to publishers. My agent was like, I don't know about that title. Let's change it. So we changed it. And then an editor that was interested in the book was like, I don't know about this title. So we talked to the editor, and it had another title temporarily. And then finally my editor bought the book. But when we were in negotiations, one of the first things she told me is, I'm gonna buy the book, but this title is gonna change. I was like, cool. So we decided on the title together, actually. We went on a bunch of rounds of like looking for sentences in the book or coming up with different like words that were associated with the book, and just came up with a bunch and then landed on The Waves Take You Home, which I love. But yes, that is something about publishing that I feel like maybe people don't talk about a lot, is that titles change a lot. Sometimes you can't get too attached to your title because, but I mean, I'm sure some people get to keep it, but I'm happy with mine.
So I guess two questions. How did you find your editor? And I guess what was the most discouraging part during this process, and like how did you work through it?
That's a great question. So my editor, so actually I'm gonna go back a little bit to answer this question. So I finished my novel in 2021, in 2020. And then in 2021, I spent the first 6 months revising it on my own. And it was so hard because I had never written a novel before. So I just had this like 80 something thousand manuscript that at the time looked insanely long. I was so overwhelmed, and I was like, I kept like changing things around and moving commas and just being like, what am I even doing? Like at that time, I was just like, I'm just gonna write another book. That's gonna be easier than just like revising this. But during that time, during the summer, I read an excerpt of the novel in a podcast, and an agent contacted me, and she was like, I love what you read. Do you have more? I was like, yes, but it's I don't know, it's the shape, it's not looking so well. So I kept talking to her, and I revised it once more, now with the incentive that I had someone that potentially was interested, and I signed with her. So that is kind of like an unorthodox way of getting an agent, because usually you query, and it could be a process that varies. For some people, get an agent in like, they query 10 and they get it in a month. For some people, it might take longer. So, but I got my agent that way. I got a great feeling, and it was great. I'm very happy about that decision. And then after that, we went on sub. And then so basically what agents do is that they make a list of editors from the big 5, from different publishers, and so they'll contact Penguin, Hachette, et cetera, and editors from those houses. And then they'll say like, yay, I want to buy it, or no. So obviously that process is, especially for a first timer like me, was was a lot, because you go through all the feelings like, oh, and it's like a rush when editors, I'm reading it, I'm loving it. You're like, yay, this is gonna happen. And then the next day they're like, no. You're like, oh. So, but yeah, so my editor, who became my editor, read it and really liked it, and she offered. That's how so basically my agent contacted her. Yeah, that was it.
How did you decide which language to write the story in?
Oh, that's a great question. I was living at the time, well, I live in the US, and at the time I was wondering about that question a lot. Um, Truthfully, it has a little bit to do with what I was reading in the talk. I wanted to start building a life here. And I had a dream and I was like, okay, I'm here. Let's try and write this in English, which honestly, it was very hard and very, very nerve-wracking to write a novel in a second language. But I'm glad I did it.
Amazing. Thank you. And lastly, Marilyn asked, what were the biggest lessons learned transitioning from flash/short fiction to a full-length novel?
Ooh, that's a great question. Let me think about it. Actually, I think the biggest lesson is that it's just to use all your toolbox that you use in your short stories and take it into your novel. Like, don't think that maybe it's like a different thing, a different part of your brain. Or this goes for the poets. People always say like poets are the best novelists, which I agree. And it's because they use their special like the way that they see language and that they like structure it, which is so beautiful and different, and they put it into their novel. So I think like that's the same for Flash, where Flash, for those of you who don't know, is basically a story that it's under 1,000 words. So very short stories. So you have to be very precise with language. So I think just like using all the lessons that I have from Flash about being very precise, thinking a lot about story structure and having it very present, and just like putting it into my novel and not being afraid of that.
That concludes our questions. Thank you so much, Maria.
Oh, thank you all. It's great.
All right, I'm going to ask you all to please give Maria another round of applause. I can't hear Zoom, but I trust your clapping. All right. Thank you so much, truly, for your time, your energy, and just your willingness to be here with us. So as she said before, if you guys have any questions, feel free to reach out to Maria on Instagram. Maria, I don't know why I can't make it all like together, but you see her right there. She writes. Then on Eds, Maria Alevaje, and then the email's there as well if you'd like to reach out to her with any questions or anything else that you have.